In this section, we are going to talk about the color management. If you are a Blender fan and also a Photoshop nerd, when you finish rendering an image from Blender, load the images inside Photoshop, start editing, you're exciting, you wanted to getting the images go to the next level, and then you start realize the moment you load in the image inside Photoshop, the color switches. I know if you have some experiences, the color switch is very minor, and if you're not kind of like a color or pixel nerd like me, you probably not even notice. But if you do, this topic is something that I want to address, specifically talking about color management between Blender and Photoshop. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about is how this color works inside of these two softwares. So as you can see here, we got some color over here. I just quickly use a brush tool, hit the beat, and then just do a couple strokes with different colors. But one thing I wanted to let you know, when you look at digital images with colors, everything, it looks pretty nice and smooth on the edge. When they are merged together, they kind of change in color. What I really want to show you is to just zoom in, all the way zoom in. I'm holding Z and just drag out in. These are just simple pixel and squares, all of these like consistent with different shading of colors, and it just put them together. But if we kind of zoom out and looks farther away and not seeing everything go pixel, then it looks like nice and smooth. Well, this is basically what the digital color or digital images consist of. It's just a bunch of colors, and with this tiny bit pixel like this is just exaggerated how you're going to look at a pixel and in different colors. They just pile them together. So that's one thing I want to put it out there to let you guys know. The images is just a bunch of colored pixels jammed together, and we're looking from further away, and that's what it looks like. Okay, so the next one I want to talk about is the image color. A lot of people get confused about what a color space works, and when they talk about the colors, they really don't have a good understanding about it. Primarily, they are focusing on the hue, saturation, and the luminosity or the brightness. That is not the case. For the image or the color space we are talking about, we really want to understand the image colors. So the image colors, there are two primary things that we need to be clear. One is the amount of colors, and we are going to dealing with certain image. Based on the amount of colors contained in this image or be able to display in this image, it was categorized by 8 bits, 16 bits, or 32 bits. So if I go to here, image, you will see the mode over here. You will see we have 8-bit channel, 16-bit channel, and 32-bit channel of images. We are capable to processing all these type of images inside Photoshop. What's the differences between 8 bits, 16 bits, and 32 bits of images? Well, primarily we're talking about the depth. So basically means the total amount of colors we'll be able to display in this particular image. For the 8 bits image, we are able to display 16 millions of different colors into that one single image. This is the capabilities. The 16 bits image can actually having 280 trillion of colors in there, which means 32 bits of images have a huge amount of colors you can display in that depth of image. The majority of the time, we're only dealing with 8 bits, and very rarely we're doing the 16 bits, primarily because millions of colors is already good enough for the shade of the tones of the colors and everything. It should be a very good number already, but 16 bits is rarely you are dealing with this. Sometimes when we're working for a file and then we're trying to minimize the size of it, we convert 16 bits after editing back to the 8 bits. So that's just general ideas. First one is the amount of the colors we want to understand for the color images. The majority of the time when we're talking about images, they're generally 8 bits. So this is something I want to put it out there, set stone, okay? So the second categories or the second criteria that is very important for images colors is the color coverage. So as you can see here, we have a diagram here, and we have a weird shape in this diagram. It's representing the color range that our human eyes can detect. We also have a different color space. That's what they're called color gamut or color coverage. Remember, we are talking about 8 bits, so which means the total amount of color can display a particular image is set. That's no changes. We don't have additional more colors between these different color spaces. No, they're all having the same amount, like 16 million colors possibility to display a single image. They all have that capacity. But differences between these color space is just because they have different coverage. So you see that small RGB have smaller coverage right here, and the Adobe RGB have bigger. And the Pro Photo RGB actually had the color space that actually bigger than what a human eyes can detect. The important message about the differences between these color spaces is not about which one is better. The important part is how you choose these color space to work for particular reason when you're dealing with color images. That is very critical. So let's go to the next slide. In order to make things a little bit simpler to understand, I highlight the major color space that we typically use when we're dealing with images as of photographers or retoucher or even 3D artists. I just simply block out the color space on this diagram. The smallest color space is sRGB, which is in right here. Adobe sRGB is a little bit bigger one. The biggest one we use inside Photoshop is the Pro Photo RGB. Here's a special one, the monitor RGB. This is something that you don't see this typically in here, simply because monitor RGB usually is special designed for your particular monitor that you use. And I have one single tool over here. It's called the color calibrator. You can call this. This is a very advanced one. This is called i1 Studio. I think this unit is being stopped manufactured. I bought this a year ago and it's still working very well. This one is not only able to read my monitor, it also can help me to calibrate my printer. Because I'm proud of photographers, sometimes I would deal with the print. And for this purpose, you can actually buy a little bit cheaper version of this type of thing. You can just search, it's called Color Monkey or Spider. I think there are some names about this. After using this, I'd be able to calibrate my monitors to creating a customized color space and making sure it's reflecting colors accurately. So that's what it's for. There are tons of instructional videos talk about how to use this type of thing. I'm not going to go over this in my course. So anyway, but that's just something I want to let you know. The bottom one is CMYK. CMYK, that representing cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So basically, this is the color for the print use. I just want to point it out to let you guys know. The majority of the time, if you're dealing with social media, website, and digitally, these color spaces are the ones you're going to deal with the majority of the time. Okay, so let's go to the next one. You might wonder how these color spaces best work for certain reason. I mentioned that in previous slide. The whole point to understanding the color space is not talking about which one is better than the other one, is to understand when to use what color space properly to getting the best result for your work. So let's talk about it. For sRGB, I know is the smallest color space on the diagram. However, it is the most common color space that is being used on websites, social media, monitors, a bunch of different places. The Pro Photo RGB, something when I start learning Photoshop as a photographer, and I watch a lot of advanced retouchers talk about, oh, you gotta use Pro Photo RGB as your color space if you working inside of Photoshop. The simple reason, as you already know, it covers more space in the color spectrum that actually can display more colors in that. It makes sense to having a bigger range of colors, and then you can kind of narrow it down to do adjustment and eventually export it out to the best color result and convert to the sRGB to display on the website. It looks cool. So you want to have more control. That's why a lot of photographers and retouchers decided to use Pro Photo RGB to have the maximum control when they're editing images. So that's why the Pro Photo RGB is very popular inside of Photoshop, because it has the biggest color space. Let's moving to the next one, Adobe RGB. If you are a photographer, if you have a camera in your hand, you can actually go back to your color settings. You can see there is a color space settings that you can choose. It's sRGB or Adobe RGB. And at the beginning, I was a photography hobbyist. I have no ideas, and I will see some videos talk about how you set up a camera, and they're saying Adobe RGB is better than sRGB. One of the reasons people saying that is because Adobe RGB has a little bit wider color space than the sRGB, right? We already seen the picture earlier, but it doesn't mean it's better than sRGB, because eventually when you are display your images on website and social media, you still need to convert to sRGB. The whole idea to having the Adobe RGB when you're setting up a camera is because you want to have a little bit wider control for your color. When you're editing them, you have more options. That's the only reason why you set up the Adobe RGB instead of sRGB in your camera when you're shooting images. It doesn't mean it's better than them. No. So just want to let you know, this is the whole reason. Let's move to the monitor RGB. The monitor RGB sometimes come with the manufacturer, and you can use that, or you can use your color calibrator to generating a customized color profile for your specific monitor. The last one, the CMYK, is primarily for the print. If you don't deal with the print, you don't need to worry about it. You may start thinking about, hey, Wenbo, you haven't talked anything about the Blender render yet with Photoshop. All right, now it's about time. After I explain all these terms and things inside of Photoshop, I'm hoping you start realize, wow, yeah, that's easy, right, Wenbo? When I render images out from Blender, I just set my color management under here to the sRGB. That's going to be my color profile. And then when I come inside of Photoshop, I'm gonna set my working space. The color is going to be the sRGB. So sRGB to sRGB, it should be good, right? I mean, color spaces are matched, so there should be zero issue with it. In theory, yes, it's supposed to work like that. It's supposed to work properly, and also it's a standardized color space. However, something a little bit different when you exporting the images out of Blender. They saying they are using the sRGB. However, when they finish the render, they're not really embedded sRGB as their profile. They're only saying the display device as sRGB and the sequencers as sRGB. I don't know exactly the terms for these, but they're not really working as RGB to embed it in the images. This is what's happening when you set up your sRGB color profile inside of Photoshop and you load a Blender render into the Photoshop. It is not showing as RGB, it's showing untagged RGB. And there is definitely a little bit minor color switch happening between here. The rest of the video is going to solve this problem. Before we get into there to really solving the problem, there will be more terms introduced. I know, I'm sorry, but in order to really understand the concept and reasons, and you have to understand these terms in order to really make sense. So the terms of these is, we have a couple of different terms. The first one is called working color space. This is talking about we are inside of Photoshop. What are the kind of color space we're using in this Photoshop software? So we're talking about the Photoshop environment color space we're using. And Photoshop is a machine, a software is not a super intelligent AI that can make their decision on their own. We need to giving them instruction. The working color space is talking about the Photoshop environment. The second one is called embedded color space. This is talking about image. Imagine this. The image has a specific way to display themselves when people are dealing with the color space. You can think about that as more like a celebrity go on stage. Each celebrity has their own way to wear their wardrobes, their styles, and they have certain reasons to dress that. And this is what an embedded color space is talking about. It's talking about the image itself. The image, it comes certain guidelines. They can decide, for this particular celebrity, I'm going to wearing sRGB as my color space. I'm going to have Pro Photo RGB as my color space. They made their decision by their own for the image. Okay, so the image itself can make decision saying what color space I want to be embedded. I want to be displayed. So this is talking about the image itself. Now is the weird things you load in a Blender render inside of Photoshop. The Blender render is a render. It's not a photograph, right? When you take a picture of a camera, you're already setting your image's color space, either sRGB or Adobe RGB. Remember that. Yeah, you can do that when you've taken pictures. You already embedded the image using your camera setting. You made a decision when you take pictures. However, when you do render images inside Blender, it says, oh, I'm gonna using sRGB. However, you know, Blender is so cool. He's respecting everybody's decisions, open source. So he said, I'm displaying your images as sRGB color profile, but I'm giving the renders own freedom to decide what color space they want to go. However, the majority of the time, as artists, we were working inside Blender. We're using the monitor sRGB color space as our reference because we're working with different colors and materials to look at the monitors and to decide, oh, this color is great and this shadow looks nice. Now I decided to render this thing out because we're using the monitor color space as our main reference. So eventually, the render we love is according to the monitor sRGB color space. I know it sounds a little bit weird, but I'm hoping this is my best way to explain it to you. So eventually, when you load your Blender render into the Photoshop, and the Photoshop just freaked out. So what's going on? What the heck? Should I go to sRGB? Or should I go, what color space you want? That's why it's putting untagged color profile over there. Of course, what we can do next is let's fix it. Here's what we're gonna do. As you can see here on the left-hand side, this is a fresh render, just came out of the oven. I'm gonna go to image and save as. And for this time, I'm going to save as TIFF file. The reason I don't save as JPEG and PNG is because the TIFF file usually is the one holding the most amount of information. Although the JPEG and the PNG is a little bit smaller than them, but I'm not worried about the file space. I'm just gonna go with the biggest file. And here I'm going to select the RGB and alpha color. That's what I'm going to do. And the color depth, 8 bits, like I talk about it, 8 bits is good enough. And compression, none. And I just gonna save this image, save as. And now we save our render. Next, we are going to load our render into this Photoshop. First thing we wanna know, what is our working color space inside of Photoshop? So let's go to the edit, color setting, click that. You can see here working spaces. We're talking about inside of Photoshop, the environment. So right now it's been set sRGB, which is the most popular one for website and social media, and also is the smallest color space. So we're gonna using sRGB. Gonna hit OK. So this is what we currently have. So now if we're loading images in, File, Open, and double click, we load the things in. And then after we loaded images inside of Photoshop, if you're not very sensitive to the colors or shading, you probably won't tell the difference between these two images. But for me, I can definitely see the color over here, it looks a little bit washed out or flatter than the one I like to have. Because the reason I'm generating this render is because I love this color, the tonalities, and the whole ideas. However, when I put inside of Photoshop, it changed slightly. You can see there, this Blender is a little bit darker than this one. So I want to change back to the way that I prefer inside of Photoshop. If you look it down here, you see this untagged RGB right here. This is what you can do. If you couldn't find it, you can just making sure you click the little arrow right here, and to click the document profile, you will know what's going on here. And later on, when we do all these fix, and eventually you will see this is going to be representing as sRGB. Then you may ask, how can we do this? Let's go back to our slides. This is the steps we're going to do. First, we need to change sRGB, which is our current working color space, to the monitor sRGB, and load Blender render into Photoshop, and then convert color profile to the sRGB, change the working color space from monitor sRGB back to sRGB, and eventually we can start editing our render inside of Photoshop. This is what we're gonna do. We're just gonna close the file we earlier used, hit no, and then we are going to go here for the first step, changing our color space into the monitor sRGB. Go to the edit, color setting, and then change sRGB to monitor sRGB. Notice I have a long name of the sRGB because this is the one I have for my monitor, and you may have different names, but the monitor sRGB is the one that you're going to use. It's just talking about the specific model and specific color profile. You may have different sub names, but just choose the monitor sRGB. That should be fine, and then hit OK. Okay, now it's time to load our Blender render inside of Photoshop with current monitor sRGB working color profile. Go to File, hit Open, and then we're gonna load this thing in. Now the color looks the way I want to look. Well, you may think, well, Wimbo, I still don't tell the differences between sRGB or the monitor sRGB. Let me show you the minor color switches between sRGB with the monitor sRGB. So trying to prove a point, there is a differences. So let's go here, edit, and go to the color setting, and I'm changing the working color space from monitor sRGB to the sRGB. Okay, hit OK. And then if I'm holding Control Z to undo what I did, watch what's happening on the color. Control Z, undo it. Yes, this is the right way that I want my Blender render working inside Photoshop, because this is the one I prefer. If I'm holding Control Shift Z to go back to the sRGB color profile, this looks flatter than the one I want to do. I know it looks a very minor switches, but for a lot of professionals, we want to having the color to be the exact way we want when we're doing a render. So if I'm holding Control Z, you can see toggle back on. You'll see there's some difference in here. The more I do it, you will see this is what's happening. So I like this tone, and this is the one we're using the monitor sRGB color profile. Okay, so this is the one we want. The next question is that, oh, Wimbo is still showing untagged sRGB. Are you just going to edit the images like this way? What I'm going to do next is the step number 3. I'm going to convert profile to sRGB. Okay, so what we do here, we're going to go to the edit and go to the convert profile, click that, and you have a small window pop over here. So right now, it's perfectly explaining what's happening. It's talking about the source space, which is the monitor RGB color space. Remember the long name we have? And we want to change this image to the sRGB, which is a destination color space that we want to go for it. So what we're going to do here, I'm just going to hit OK to convert from monitor sRGB to sRGB finally for this particular image. Hit OK. So immediately you will see at the bottom here, this particular document become an image with sRGB color profile. The next thing we can do here, you can just kind of do all the adjustment layers, doing the curves according to whatever you want to do. The section of this course is trying to solving this color management issues between the Blender and Photoshop. So I know it's not a huge differences, but if you are working professionals, you will know how important we need to do this proper color management between these two software. Okay, this is everything I want to share in this videos. I will see you in the next one.